Hey guys, today I wanted to answer a question I see all the time in the comments on my YouTube channel, and that is, do you need ND filters? So I'm going to be answering that, and I'm also going to be showing you how I use my ND filters when I'm out flying. I've come out today in a slightly cloudy Northern Ireland, but we'll make do. I'm going to show you how I use them, and I'm going to explain the benefits of using them. Let's jump right in. Now, full disclosure, the filters I'm going to be using today are these filters that Freewell have sent me out for my DJI Mavic 3. Again, don't be alarmed if you don't have a DJI Mavic 3. Freewell also make excellent filters for the DJI Mini 2, which I have and have been using for a long time now, and they're also fantastic. I'm going to put a link to these ones for the Mavic 3 and the ones for the DJI Mini 2 below, so you can get ND filters for whatever drone you have. This set for the Mavic 3 is fantastic. It comes with an ND4 polarizing, an ND8 polarizing, ND16 polarizing and an ND32 polarizing. That will cover you for 99% of the time you're out flying. Then you also get an ND64 for them super bright days. You also get a CPL, a circular polarizer, and then you also get an ND1000 and an ND2000, and they're for long exposure photography, which is really fun to do. So let's get the drone up. Let me show you how I use these filters and expose correctly while also getting motion blur. So I brought my DJI Mavic 3 out today, but don't worry because these tips will apply to DJI Mini 2 or any other drone. The methods I use for these ND filters and the reasons for using them apply for all drones, so that's nothing to be concerned about. So just get my drone out, get it opened up, and as you can see, to begin with, I have no ND filter on. So how do ND filters help you get cinematic video? Well, it's all to do with something called the 180-degree shutter rule to get motion blur. Now, what is motion blur? Well, motion blur is where any areas of movement in your video get blurred. And the reason why that helps you get cinematic video is because our eyes always see motion blur. And so if you see a piece of video which doesn't have motion blur because the shutter speed is really high, so for example, you see a car going down a road and the wheels are turning, but you can see the spokes super detailed, it doesn't look cinematic, your eyes can tell something's off. So to get cinematic video, you want that motion blur, and to get that motion blur, you employ the 180-degree shutter rule. The 180-degree shutter speed rule is that your shutter speed must always be double your frame rate. So if you film at 25 FPS, then your shutter speed should be 50. If you film at 30 FPS, your shutter speed should be 60. If you film at 60 FPS, your shutter speed should be 120, and that will give you motion blur. But the problem with that is having your shutter speed so low usually leads to your highlights being completely blown out. And I'm going to demonstrate that now and demonstrate how you use these ND filters. Okay, so I've got my Mavic 3 turned on. I'm just going to put it down on the ground super quick. I'm going to set my manual video settings to settings we want to get motion blur. So I've got it at 4K, 30 FPS. Now if you remember, the shutter speed should be double the frame rate. My frame rate is 25 FPS, so I've set my shutter speed to 1/50. I'm just going to put the aperture to 4. I think that's the perfect sharpness for the Mavic 3. If you can't adjust the aperture like in the DJI Mini 2, don't worry about that. Now, something that you want to turn on and something I find super useful is if you go into settings, you want to scroll down till you see overexposure warning. I already have it on. Let me turn it off just to show you the difference. So that's it off. We'll talk about the blown out whiteness in a second. And I'm going to now turn it on. And what you'll see is that overlays these zebras in areas that are overexposed. Now, why is it important that we don't overexpose the image? Well, if you take a look at this example, what this means is all this white will not be recoverable in post. So it's usually the sky that looks like this. And if your sky looks completely white in the screen and you're getting these overexposure warnings on it, when you bring it back into your editor, the sky will just be completely white and you will not be able to recover that in post. You'll never be able to see them clouds again. And for a nice exposed, properly exposed image, we want the sky and all the nice clouds and everything to be in it. So you can see the problem here. When I've set my settings to 1/50, which is twice my FPS, to get motion blur, the image, if I bring the drone up, is completely overexposed. Like you can barely see anything. Now normally what you do if you weren't worried about motion blur is you just tweak the manual settings. So you could bring the shutter speed up to 1/200. Actually in this case, we need to go way up to like 1/800 to bring back that sky. And now you can see them overexposure warnings have pretty much gone, and that means our image is exposed nicely, and all that information is there. We'll be able to use it in our video editor. It's not completely blown out and unrecoverable, but 1/800 is not going to give us motion blur. So if I bring that back down over 1/50, you might see where this is going. To bring this image down, to bring the brightness down, to get it properly exposed, we need to put a darker piece of glass in front of the lens to stop as much light getting in so we can expose this image properly. That's it in a nutshell. That's what ND filters do. So how do I decide which ND filter to use? Well, it's actually deceptively simple. I basically hold the drone up and I take a look on the app screen and I have a look to see how much is overexposed. And remember, you can see that with the overexposure zebras. And then what I'll do is I'll just pick a strength of ND filter I think I need. Remember, if you pick one that's too dark, you can always go lighter. So I'm going to start with a ND 16, I think. So it's really simple and straightforward to do. These Freewell filters are absolutely fantastic. The filter in the front of the DJI Mavic 3 just clicks off. And you take the Freewell filter and you just click it on. And then what you do is you hold the drone up again and you have a look on the app to see what the exposure looks like. Now, a really handy top tip. If you want to know how close to perfectly exposed you are, a visual guide is the manual metering down in the bottom right of the app. You see the little MM. Now, you want that to be as close to 0 as possible. Now, that's not always going to be possible. Here you can see it's at -1, and that's with the ND 16 on. So what you can do is you can actually increase the ISO slightly. So if I increase that ISO to 200 and hold it up, you can now see it's 0. So that would be a perfectly exposed image. You just don't want to jack up the ISO too much, as too much ISO can cause noisy footage. Now let's say, for example, the image was way too dark when you put that ND filter on. So let's change the ND 16 down to an ND 8. So all you would do is you take the ND filter off, you just twist it off, and I'm going to take an ND 8 and I've just popped the ND 8 on. Now I put the ISO back down to 100, and actually, as you can see, the manual metering is minus 0.3. That's as close to 0 really as you're going to get. And that means without using a higher ISO than 100, you should always really try and keep it to 100 if possible. This ND filter is perfect. And now you can see we have no overexposure warnings. We have a nice, perfectly exposed image. You can see all that cloud detail in the sky, and you can see the whites of the sea. None of that's overexposed. We don't get any overexposure warning. And that's how you use ND filters to get a perfectly exposed image. And that's my process. It's basically a glorified trial and error process. You hold the drone up. If it's overexposed, you take a guess at the strength of the ND filter you put on. If it's perfect, great. If it's too light, you put a darker one on. And if it's too dark, you put a lighter one on. And with these Freewell filters, you just twist on and off. It's great. And like I say, if you don't have a DJI Mavic 3, they do filters for the DJI Mini 2 and they pop on and off just as easy. So there you have it. That's my process for using ND filters, and in particular, the Freewell filters, which I've been trying out today. And if you've learned something new and you've liked this video, please let me know by giving it the thumbs up, by clicking that like button down below. And if you love all things drones and want to learn more about how to get cinematic photos and videos with your drone, then I recommend you check out my channel where I have a ton of other content to help you level up your drone game. If you want to stick around and watch a few more of them videos now, then here's a few that I personally recommend. I'll not keep you back any further. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.